That night, the apartment building was finally silent. No bass rattling the glasses in the cupboard, no shrill laughter from downstairs, no angry fists beating her ceiling. Just the ticking of a small kitchen clock and the sound of her own breathing. Margaret stood in the dark by the window, looking down at the light still glowing in her neighbor's window. Tomorrow, she thought, the noise would stop. Not because she begged, not because she cried, but because she had finally decided to fight back. Hello, dear friends. I'm Helen Moore, and this is a new story about revenge and justice. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more emotional life stories. For most of her life, Margaret Lawson had loved quiet. She was 68, a retired librarian, and her small apartment on the top floor of an old brick building felt like a nest. Mornings began with the gentle hiss of the kettle, the scent of black tea with a slice of lemon, and the soft rustle of the newspaper. Old wooden shelves lined the walls, filled with books. A crocheted blanket lay over the arm of her favorite chair. When she opened the window, she could hear pigeons cooing and the distant hum of traffic. Her neighbors used to be mostly older people like her. Polite nods in the stairwell, brief conversations about the weather, a shared understanding that walls in old buildings were thin and nights were for sleep. Then, one spring, the apartment below hers was rented to a new tenant, a woman in her 30s named Kayla. Kayla arrived with loud friends, louder suitcases, and a speaker bigger than Margaret's television. At first, Margaret tried to be hopeful. Young people like music, she told herself, placing a plate of home-baked cookies on a tray. She went downstairs, knocked on the door, and introduced herself. Kayla opened the door with a phone in her hand and music already playing in the background. "Hi, I'm Margaret from upstairs," Margaret said, smiling. "Welcome to the building." "Oh, thanks," Kayla said, glancing briefly at the plate before putting it aside. "If you ever need anything, just knock," Margaret added. "Sure," Kayla said. For a week things were bearable. Then the nights changed. Then midnight, then 2 in the morning. Heavy bass thumping through the floor, laughter, shouting, doors slamming. Margaret lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her heart pounding in time with the beat she hadn't chosen. The next morning, tired but calm, she went downstairs. She knocked. Kayla opened, wearing headphones. "Good morning," Margaret said gently. "I'm sorry to bother you, but the music last night was very loud. I couldn't sleep." Kayla shrugged. "I work late. Night's the only time I can relax. I'll try, but, you know." "It's life in this building, too," Margaret replied softly. "Then maybe you're used to it by now," Kayla said, already closing the door. The music continued. Weeks turned into months. The late-night parties became routine. Sometimes it was just music. Other nights, a group of people came over, laughing, arguing, clattering around the kitchen at 3 in the morning. The bass vibrated through Margaret's bed frame. Her teacups rattled on their saucers. She tried everything polite people try. She bought earplugs. She turned on a small fan for white noise. She knocked again, several times, always asking calmly, always trying to explain that she had high blood pressure and needed sleep. Kayla rolled her eyes. "You're so sensitive." One particularly bad night, when the music grew so intense that Margaret's chest hurt, she called the non-emergency line for the police. They came, spoke to Kayla, and the music lowered for one night. The next evening it was back, louder, as if in punishment. Kayla yelled up the stairwell the next day. Then came the complaints. Margaret returned from the supermarket one afternoon to find a note on her door from the building manager. "We've received reports that you stomp on the floor at night, disturb your downstairs neighbor, and slam windows early in the morning." Her hands shook as she read it. Stomp on the floor? She could barely walk quickly, let alone stomp. She went to the office in the basement. "Mr. Jenkins, this isn't true," she said, holding the note. He sighed. I get complaints from both of you. She says you're making noise. You say she is. But I've lived here 20 years. And tenants change, he cut in. I can't afford conflict. It got worse. Kayla began slamming her door whenever she went out or came home. Loud enough for other neighbors to hear. When Margaret passed someone in the hall, they looked away, uncomfortable. Then, one day the conflict did more than steal sleep. Margaret had been waiting 6 months for a scheduled surgery, a minor but important procedure on her knee. The hospital called on a Thursday to confirm the time, the nurse said. Margaret set her alarm, laid out her clothes, and placed the documents by the door. That night, she went to bed early, nervous but hopeful. This surgery would help her walk without pain again. She needed it. At midnight, the music began, louder than ever. She could hear the lyrics perfectly, the bass shaking the light fixture. She pressed a pillow over her ears. Then, heart pounding, she went downstairs in her robe. She knocked and knocked until the door opened. Kayla stood there, drink in hand, friends laughing behind her. I have surgery in the morning, Margaret said, voice trembling. Please, I need to sleep. Not my problem, Kayla replied. You should have thought about that before calling the cops on me. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. Kayla smiled, a cold, small thing. This is my apartment, my life. I pay rent too. And she closed the door. M. When Margaret's alarm rang at 6, she felt sick with exhaustion. Her head spun when she tried to stand. Her daughter, who was supposed to drive her, took one look at her shaking hands and said, Mom, you can't go into surgery like this. At the hospital, they confirmed it. Her blood pressure was too high. The anesthesiologist refused to proceed. The surgery was postponed for months. Margaret sat in a hallway chair, staring at the floor, feeling more powerless than she had in years. I shouldn't have to leave my home because someone else behaves badly, Margaret whispered. That evening, as the sun went down and faint vibrations of music began again below, something in her shifted. Enough, she thought. Enough. Margaret was many things. Tired, hurt, older than she used to be. But she was not stupid, and she was not helpless. She started by writing everything down. She bought a small notebook and marked dates, times, descriptions. M. June 10th. Complaint letter from manager. She noted witnesses. Her daughter visiting neighbors. The security guard who once heard the noise in the lobby. Then she bought a simple sound level meter, the kind you can get online, and began measuring the noise. She stood in her bedroom and recorded decibel levels during Kayla's parties. She kept the readings, carefully noting time and date. Next, she started reading. She dug out her reading glasses, made tea, and sat at her table with her old laptop. She looked up city noise ordinances, tenant rights, and procedures for formal complaints. M. And that repeated violations could be grounds for eviction if properly documented. She also learned something about Kayla. From conversations in the stairwell and a bit of cautious social media searching, she found out that Kayla ran a small online marketing business from home, legally allowed, but subject to certain rules. And on her public profile, Kayla boasted about her networking nights hosted in her apartment. There were photos, loud gatherings, drinks, even promotional banners. Margaret saved them all. When she had enough, she made appointments, not with the building manager, who had brushed her off, but with people above him. First, she visited the local tenants' rights office. She brought her notebook, printouts of the noise laws, and evidence photos. The counselor listened, eyebrows rising higher with each page. He asked, "Yes," Margaret said. "I used to manage a library archive." He nodded with new respect. "You have a strong case. The manager shouldn't be ignoring this." Second, she wrote a calm, detailed letter to the building's owner, not just the manager. with copies of her documentation and a mention of the fact that Kayla appeared to be running frequent business events that might violate the lease's "no commercial events" clause. Finally, she made one more quiet move. She bought a small, legal white noise machine and placed it near her bedroom wall. Not loud enough to bother anyone else, just enough to help her sleep a little while she waited. Because she knew the wheels of justice turned slowly, but they did turn if pushed. And Margaret had decided to push. The first sign that her plan was working came 2 weeks later. Kayla was coming up the stairs, talking loudly on the phone, when she saw a notice taped to her door. She snapped, tearing it down. Margaret, listening from above, heard paper crinkle and a sudden silence. It was a formal warning from the building's owner, citing multiple documented noise violations, reports from tenants, and potential misuse of the apartment for commercial gatherings. It referenced city noise ordinances and stated that further violations could result in termination of her lease. That night, the music went on again, but not as long. Margaret measured, documented, and sent the results directly to the owner and the tenant's office. Kayla's anger shifted from loud to desperate. She knocked on Margaret's door, face red. She demanded. Margaret looked at her calmly. "I documented the noise the way you documented lies about me," Kayla shouted. "I work from home." "You ruined my surgery," Margaret replied quietly. "You ruined my sleep, my health, and my peace for months. I asked you gently." Kayla scoffed. "You could have talked to me instead of running to lawyers like some—" "I did talk to you," Margaret interrupted, her voice still soft but firm. "Many times." She closed the door, heart pounding, not from fear, but from the unfamiliar thrill of standing her ground. A few days later, the tenant's rights office sent Kayla a formal notice, informing her that further documented violations could lead to legal action and heavy fines. The building owner, worried about being liable, scheduled a surprise late-night check one weekend. And listened as Kayla's music shook the walls. The next week, an eviction notice was filed. Kayla fought it, of course. She wrote angry emails, posted online about her evil neighbor, even tried to rally other tenants. But Margaret had allies now. The older man on the second floor who had also been losing sleep, the single mother whose child woke up crying at every party, the security guard who had logged multiple noise complaints. The judge looked at the records, dates, decibel readings, letters, ignored warnings, and made a simple decision. The eviction was upheld. Kayla had 30 days to leave. When movers finally carried boxes down the stairs, the building felt different, lighter. Kayla avoided Margaret's eyes, but once, on her last trip, she paused. "You know you could have just minded your own business," she said bitterly. Margaret met her gaze, unflinching. "You made my suffering your business." Asshole. Kayla looked away and left without another word. The door of the apartment below closed one last time. For the first time in many months, the silence afterward felt like a blessing, not a threat. The months that followed were almost shockingly peaceful. Margaret's surgery was rescheduled. This time, the night before, she slept soundly. Her blood pressure was stable, the doctors smiling as they wheeled her into the operating room. The procedure went well. Recovery was slow but steady, and each step hurt a little less than the last. Back at home, she moved through rooms that no longer vibrated with someone else's choices. She made tea, listened to music at a volume she chose, and sometimes simply sat in her chair, enjoying the quiet she had once assumed was guaranteed. A new tenant eventually moved into Kayla's old apartment. A young man who introduced himself politely, asked about the building's quirks, and, most importantly, wore headphones at night. "Please tell me if I'm ever too loud," he said. Margaret laughed, a real warm laugh she hadn't felt in a while. She didn't become bitter or obsessed with rules, but she did become firmer. When the building manager tried to dismiss another complaint from a neighbor, she gently reminded him of the city ordinances and the owner's responsibility. She had earned a reputation now, not as a troublemaker, but as someone who knew her rights and would calmly insist on them. Her daughter noticed the change. "You seem stronger, Mom," she said one afternoon while they shared lemon cake at the kitchen table. "I just remembered something I forgot for a while," Margaret replied. "That my peace isn't a favor someone gives me," she said. Years passed, and the story of the noisy neighbor became just one chapter in Margaret's life, not the whole book. She joined a small tenants group in the area, helping other older residents understand how to document problems and who to talk to instead of suffering in silence. Her knee healed well. She began taking slow morning walks in the nearby park, listening to birds instead of late-night bass. Sometimes when she passed young people playing music on a bench, she smiled to herself. Noise in the day didn't bother her. It wasn't about hating sound. It was about respecting boundaries. Once she saw Kayla's name online in a local forum, complaining about a landlord in another part of town. Margaret read a few lines, then closed the page. That chapter was over. Kayla would face her own lessons. Back at home, Margaret opened her window, letting in the afternoon breeze. The building was calm. A baby crying faintly somewhere, a TV murmuring behind a closed door. Ordinary sounds of shared life. She poured herself a cup of tea, wrapped her hands around the warm mug, and allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Because in the end, her revenge had never been about shouting or sinking to her neighbor's level. Thank you for listening. Do you think she went too far, or did she simply take back her justice? Share your thoughts in the comments.